A white passenger insulted a black family mid-flight. Seconds later, the father made sure the whole cabin remembered who they were dealing with, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He thought a baby's pain was entertainment. He didn't realize the flame he lit would mark his own fate. Subscribe if you believe cruelty deserves no mercy. The tray table clicked back into place as Malik Torin adjusted the blanket covering his sleeping infant son, Kalen. The cabin lights had not yet dimmed, but the mood inside the plane already carried a subtle strain, a quiet pressure beneath the hum of the engines. From the corner of his eye, Malik noticed the man across the aisle shift in his seat again. The tapping had returned, that constant, rhythmic drumming of fingers against the armrest, agitated, impatient, loud only in its persistence. Malik didn't look over this time. He already knew who it was. The man's name, printed faintly on the tag of his carry-on bag, was Royce Brenner. Middle-aged, heavy-set, face half-shadowed by an unshaven jaw and a permanent scowl, Royce hadn't smiled once since boarding. From the moment Malik had settled into his seat with Kalen in his arms, Royce had made his displeasure known, loud sighs, eye rolls, and muttered remarks just under his breath. Kalen, barely 6 months old, hadn't cried once, not really, but every tiny whimper or shift from the baby brought another exaggerated gesture from Royce, as though Malik had committed a crime by simply bringing a child aboard. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, sunlight filtered through the window beside Malik's seat, bathing the cabin in soft gold. The warmth was calming. Kalen stirred slightly, his little fingers curling tighter around Malik's thumb. Malik smiled down at him, grateful for the rare moment of peace. But that peace shattered in an instant. "I don't know why people like you insist on traveling with babies," Royce muttered, just loud enough to be heard across the aisle. His voice was gravelly, dripping with disdain, the kind that pretended to be casual but aimed to wound. Malik turned his head slowly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice level but firm. Royce didn't even glance at him. "It's inconsiderate, that's all," he said, still pretending to look at the safety card in the seat pocket. "Some of us pay good money to rest, not to hear whining." Malik studied the man's profile for a moment. His eyes were tired, but not with sleep. It was something else, bitterness, maybe, or something deeper. Still, Malik chose silence. He looked down at Kalen again, brushing his thumb gently across the child's soft forehead. The baby shifted, murmured, then quieted. "I'll do my best to keep him comfortable," Malik said finally. His tone was calm, but beneath it lay a quiet firmness, a boundary being drawn. Royce scoffed and leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "You people always say that." That last part hit different. Malik stiffened, but again, he said nothing. He wouldn't give Royce the satisfaction. Not here, not now. He reminded himself of the assignment waiting at home, the long hours of coding and calibration ahead, the lab that depended on him. This flight was supposed to be uneventful, a quiet bridge between duty and family, not a battlefield. The tension didn't ease. In fact, it grew heavier, more suffocating, as if the air itself began to thicken. Darren, a young flight attendant in a neatly pressed uniform, moved up the aisle with a cart, offering drinks. He paused beside Malik, flashing a polite smile. "Anything for you, sir?" "Just water, please," Malik replied softly, "and a napkin." As Darren handed over the items, he glanced once at Royce, then quickly away, the unease in his eyes barely hidden. Malik caught it. So did Royce, who offered a toothless smile and waved the offer of a drink away with one annoyed flick of his hand. The tapping returned, louder now. Malik took a slow breath. Kalen shifted again, a tiny whimper escaping him before settling back into sleep. The baby's breath was soft, rhythmic, but the man across the aisle leaned forward suddenly, elbows on knees, and hissed, "Can't you shut him up?" The words cut through the air like a whip. Darren froze in the aisle. A couple of passengers 2 rows ahead turned their heads. Malik sat straighter in his seat. "He's just a baby," Malik said, keeping his voice even, controlled. "And he's asleep." Royce gave a sharp laugh, humorless and dry. "Barely." Darren stepped closer, his voice cautious. "Is everything all right here?" Malik nodded. "Everything's fine." But Royce wasn't done. "You think just because you have a baby in your arms, you can get away with anything? Some of us came here to breathe, not babysit your mistakes." Something flickered behind Malik's eyes, a storm that didn't show on the surface. He looked back out the window, forcing his jaw to unclench. Not now, not in front of Kaylin. The plane rocked slightly as it hit a patch of mild turbulence. Darren moved on, sensing the atmosphere too sharp to linger. Malik carefully reached for his cup, but the jolt caused a small splash of water to leap over the rim. A few drops landed on the edge of Royce's armrest. The man jerked back as if scalded. "Unbelievable," he growled, grabbing a napkin from the tray table and furiously wiping the spot. "You people have no manners." "I said I'm sorry," Malik replied, his voice cold now. His patience had worn thin. Royce didn't respond. He sat back in his chair, fuming silently, the tension crawling back into the crevices of the cabin. Even the hum of the engine seemed to dull under the weight of that anger. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak up or stay hidden behind their earbuds and books. Malik's fingers moved gently over Kaylin's back, soothing the child who stirred only slightly. His thoughts began to splinter, memories of other times, other places, where keeping calm was the only shield against humiliation. He'd hoped this flight would be different. Royce reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out, small, metallic. A lighter. He didn't light a cigarette. He simply began flicking it open and closed. The tiny flame danced with each click, a strange orange flicker in the pressurized calm of the cabin. Malik watched the flame, watched Royce's eyes. There was something in them now, deliberate, menacing. Not just irritation. This wasn't about noise anymore. It wasn't about babies or seats or spilled water. It was about something darker. "You even know how to be a father?" Royce sneered without looking at him, still flicking the lighter. "Put that away," Malik said quietly. But Royce leaned slightly across the aisle, voice barely above a whisper, words heavy with venom. "Maybe I'll teach your kid how to behave." That was the moment Darren returned, stepping in again. "Sir, you can't have that out," he said firmly, gesturing toward the lighter. Royce didn't argue. He snapped it shut and slipped it back into his pocket, the smirk returning to his lips like a shadow crawling over stone. Darren lingered a second longer, then moved on. Malik said nothing, but the stillness inside him wasn't peace. It was the calm before the strike, a growing weight, the slow realization that this man, this stranger, wasn't just cruel. He was dangerous. He held Kaylin tighter, kissed the top of the baby's head, and looked down at the small hand still clinging to his thumb. The light outside the window shifted. The sun had risen higher, but inside the air had turned colder. Sometimes evil begins not with a shout, but a whisper. The sound came sharp and venomous. "Can't you shut him up?" Royce Brenner's voice cut through the quiet like a serrated edge, loud enough to turn a few heads in the nearby rows. His glare, hard and unyielding, was aimed at Malik Torin, who sat cradling his infant son, Kaylin, in his arms. Malik looked up slowly from his tablet, his fingers still gently stroking the baby's back. Kaylin had only whimpered, a small, breathy sound, more sigh than cry, but it had been enough to ignite the older man's simmering contempt. Malik met Royce's eyes, calm but firm. "He's just a baby, sir." "I'll keep him quiet," he replied, his voice steady, controlled. Royce scoffed and turned away with exaggerated irritation, muttering something under his breath that Malik chose not to catch. Across the aisle, Flight attendant Darren Cole froze momentarily mid-step. The young trainee had been on edge since boarding, nervous, unsure of himself, and clearly aware of the growing friction between the two men. He hesitated, casting a quick glance toward Malik, then toward Royce, before continuing down the aisle without a word. Malik exhaled softly, not in defeat, but in restraint. He adjusted Kalen's blanket and continued rocking him, trying to return his attention to the article glowing on his tablet. The text blurred slightly, not from the light turbulence the plane was experiencing, but from the heaviness of the moment. It wasn't just the noise that had provoked Royce, it was something deeper, something uglier. Malik had seen that look before. It wasn't new. Outside the cabin windows, clouds swirled into dense, cotton-like masses as the aircraft gently swayed. Inside, the atmosphere remained brittle, quiet, but charged. Malik could sense it in the way other passengers subtly leaned away, how shoulders stiffened whenever Royce shifted in his seat. It was as though the entire section was waiting, holding its collective breath. Then it happened. A sudden jolt rocked the plane as it hit a pocket of turbulence. It wasn't violent, but sharp enough to tip a plastic cup from Malik's tray, sending a thin splash of orange juice onto Royce's armrest. The liquid trickled toward the edge, a small rivulet of citrus that gleamed under the overhead light. Malik's hand shot out, catching the cup before more could spill. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, grabbing a napkin and reaching forward. Royce's reaction was immediate and explosive. "You people have no manners," he barked, yanking a napkin from the tray table and aggressively wiping at the drops. His tone wasn't just angry, it was accusatory, loaded, and meant to sting. The nearby passengers stirred. A young man a few rows back shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while an elderly gentleman diagonally across lowered his magazine slightly, watching the scene unfold. But no one spoke. No one intervened. Malik didn't move, didn't rise to the bait. He looked directly at Royce and set the napkin down slowly. "It was an accident," he said. "There's no need to make it personal." Royce leaned in slightly, his face taut with disdain. "It became personal the moment you brought a crying baby onto a plane full of people who actually paid to relax." Darren Cole reappeared down the aisle, his eyes wide as he saw the confrontation reigniting. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered again. The young attendant looked torn between duty and fear, uncertain whether stepping in would calm the fire or fuel it. Malik turned toward him. "It's okay," he said calmly, sensing the hesitation. "Nothing more needs to happen." But Royce was already smirking, pleased that his words had drawn attention, that he had pushed just enough to disturb the peace. His fingers drummed the armrest, slow and mocking. Malik resumed rocking Kalen, who had begun to stir again. The baby let out another small cry, unsettled by the tension in his father's arms. Malik whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "It's okay, son." "We're almost home." From the corner of his eye, he caught Royce watching. That same satisfaction lingered on the older man's face, smug, dangerous. Malik's thoughts drifted briefly to his wife's final advice before he boarded. "Don't let anyone steal your calm, Malik." Kalen needs that more than anything. But it was getting harder. This wasn't just a rude passenger. This was a man who wanted a reaction, a man who thrived on stirring the peace and poisoning the air around him. As the plane hit another mild dip, Malik tightened his grip on his son, not in fear, but in silent promise. No matter what this flight became, he would not let it end with his son harmed or his own dignity shattered. There was something festering behind Royce's words, something that wasn't finished yet. A few minutes later, the overhead lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants began collecting empty cups and trays. The clinking of plastic and soft footsteps filled the void left by the confrontation. But for Malik, the silence wasn't peace. It was warning. He leaned back into his seat, never taking his eyes fully off Royce. The man had turned toward the window, but Malik knew better than to assume calm had returned. The storm outside wasn't half as dangerous as the one brewing inside row 14. As the plane leveled again, a sharp ding pierced the soft hum of the cabin. Royce had pressed the call button. The sudden sound cut through the tension like a blade, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Darren Cole, the young flight attendant who had been nervously adjusting glasses behind the beverage cart, straightened and approached. Royce didn't wait for a greeting. He jabbed a finger across the aisle toward Malik, his voice louder than necessary. "You need to control that man and his brat," he snapped, lips curled in a theatrical display of disgust. Darren blinked, visibly flustered. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." "You do understand," Royce interrupted, his tone sharp and performative. "I paid for peace and quiet, not a crying circus." Across the aisle, Malik turned his head slowly, not in challenge but in quiet disbelief. His eyes, calm yet edged with steel, met Darren's first. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of restraint sat heavy in his chest. He rocked his son gently, feeling Kaylin shift softly against him. Darren hesitated, caught between the roles of peacekeeper and witness. "Sir, the child isn't being disruptive," he offered weakly, "and the seatbelt sign is still on." Royce snorted and leaned back into his seat with exaggerated frustration. But the moment wasn't over. Not for him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter. With a flick of his thumb, the flame hissed to life. He didn't smoke. There were no cigarettes in sight. He simply held the lighter there, flicking it open and shut, again and again, the tiny flame flaring, retreating, flaring again. The orange light danced across his face like a warning. The act was deliberate. Malik's eyes flicked to the lighter. His jaw clenched. "You even know how to be a father?" Royce asked, not even pretending to whisper. The words were dipped in malice, meant to sting and provoke. Malik inhaled once, deeply, holding his breath a second longer before releasing it. His voice came low and even. "Put that away." Royce didn't comply. Instead, he leaned slightly forward in his seat, just enough to invade Malik's space without technically crossing any lines. The flame reflected in his narrowed eyes. "Maybe I'll teach your kid how to behave," he whispered, his smile thin and mean, as if daring Malik to react. The world seemed to shrink in that moment. The engine hum, once a background comfort, now sounded too loud, like a pressure rising behind the walls. The air blowing from the overhead vents turned colder, harsher, brushing against Malik's skin like the prickle of a storm on the horizon. Darren took a step forward, finally shaken from his stunned stillness. "Sir, you can't have an open flame on board," he said urgently, voice cracking slightly. That's against safety policy." Royce extinguished the flame with a smug flick. "Just keeping my fingers warm," he muttered with mock innocence, slipping the lighter back into his coat. But the smirk on his face lingered too long, too knowingly. It wasn't the smirk of someone who'd simply made a mistake. It was the grin of someone playing a long, cruel game. Malik shifted his gaze toward the window, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He felt the rise of adrenaline in his veins, the itch in his fingertips that begged for action. But he held it back. He looked down at Kaylin, who slept with his little fist still curled near Malik's chest, completely unaware of the darkness pressing closer around them. Malik wasn't afraid of confrontation. But this wasn't just confrontation. It was provocation with intent, carefully measured, publicly performed, and dripping with something more dangerous than simple rudeness. He glanced at Darren, who still stood awkwardly, unsure whether the moment had passed or if it was just changing shape. Malik's eyes didn't ask for help. They asked for accountability. Darren swallowed, nodded faintly, and stepped back without another word. Malik knew then that he was alone in this, for now. The warning signs were clear, and Royce wasn't finished. Whatever was coming, it would not be subtle, and Malik would be ready. Sometimes restraint is the quietest form of resistance, but also the most dangerous. Malik woke to the sound of a scream. Not just any scream, a high, piercing wail that froze the blood in his veins. Kalen. His eyes flew open. The cabin lights were dimmed, casting long, soft shadows across the rows of seats. For a brief second, disorientation gripped him, until his gaze locked on the glowing red tip of a cigarette, inches from his baby's face. Royce. The man's hand hovered just above Kalen, the cigarette ember pulsing like an open wound in the dark. Smoke curled in thin tendrils toward the air vents. Kalen shrieked again, his body squirming helplessly in Malik's arms. Malik didn't think, he moved. Instinct took over. He surged forward with the full weight of his body, one arm securing Kalen, the other slamming Royce's wrist to the side. The cigarette flew, bouncing harmlessly against the tray table before falling to the floor and extinguishing on the carpet with a faint hiss. "Kalen!" Malik gasped, cradling his son against his chest, his hand trembling as it brushed over the baby's cheek. The skin was blistered, small, red, and angry. A perfect round mark, fresh and cruel. Malik's mind blanked for a moment, flooded with a single truth. His child had been burned. Not by accident, by intent. Royce leaned back, expression unreadable, his shoulders tense with the echoes of sudden impact. For a moment, he said nothing. The hum of the plane engines seemed to roar in Malik's ears, louder than before. The rest of the cabin was waking slowly, some startled, others confused, heads rising, eyes adjusting to the sudden chaos. "What did you do?" Malik's voice came out as a whisper, but each word cut through the air like a blade. Royce sneered, brushing his sleeve as if shaking off dust. "Calm down." It was nothing. Probably just a reaction. Babies cry. You'd know that if... "You touched him," Malik said, louder now. His voice cracked with something deeper than rage. "You burned my son." The word hung in the air, ugly and impossible to ignore. Darren, the young flight attendant, rushed forward from the galley, eyes wide in disbelief. "Sir." "What happened?" Malik turned just enough for Darren to see Kalen's cheek. The baby's sobs were quieter now, more gasps than cries, but the red mark was unmistakable. Darren's breath caught. "Oh, no. Is that... Did he..." Malik didn't answer. He stood, one hand gripping Royce's collar, lifting him slightly from his seat. The tension in his arm was visible, veins taut, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Royce's bravado faltered. His voice dropped to a defensive mutter. "Back off." "You're making a scene. You're going to get yourself arrested. You hurt my son," Malik repeated, his eyes locked on Royce's face. The cabin was no longer asleep. Passengers were rising, murmuring, some standing in their rows to see. One man leaned into the aisle. Another reached for the attendant call button. The tension was contagious, spreading like static electricity down the length of the aircraft. "Kalen," Malik whispered, looking down again. The baby had his eyes half open now, soft whimpers replacing his screams. Malik's grip on Royce didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened. Royce's mouth twisted. "It's just a burn." "Babies heal." Darren froze, then stepped forward quickly. "Sir, please." "That's enough. Sit down now." Malik's eyes didn't move. "He touched my son." The baby whimpered again, and it snapped something inside Malik, something that had been held together by sheer will since the flight began. All the restraint, all the dignity he had clung to in the face of irritation, contempt, and rising hostility, it cracked, not like glass, but like something sharp and forged now breaking free. Passengers began raising their voices. "Is that a burn on the baby?" "Did he really?" "Where's the air marshal?" Malik slowly let go of Royce's collar, his hand shaking not from fear but from holding back. Darren moved between them, visibly sweating, his hands raised like a barrier between two sparks ready to ignite. "I need backup here," Darren muttered into his radio. Malik sat back down, gently rocking Kalen, brushing a cool cloth against his blistered cheek. He didn't say a word, but his stare burned holes into Royce, who had the nerve to roll his eyes and stretch his neck as though he were the one inconvenienced. The lights remained dim, but the illusion of calm was gone. A sharp buzz came over the intercom as the captain's voice crackled faintly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently in communication with ground control and will be making an emergency diversion. Please remain in your seats and follow all crew instructions." Darren knelt beside Malik. "Sir, is he breathing okay?" Malik nodded faintly. "He's strong." "He'll be okay. We have a medical kit if you want me to." "No." Malik's tone stopped him short. "Just make sure no one touches him again." Royce huffed under his breath, leaning back with folded arms, but he wasn't smiling now. His smirk was gone. The way Malik had looked at him, calm and cold, had unsettled something in the man. Across the cabin, someone whispered, "I got it on video." Another voice, "That guy's done for." The flames of justice had not yet burned Royce, but they had certainly been lit. Malik stroked his son's head slowly. His thoughts spun in silence, but one truth remained carved into him now, heavier than any judgment the law might give. That scream would haunt the cabin long after the engines went silent. The cry had barely faded when the cabin erupted into chaos. Darren Cole lunged forward first, instinctively trying to pry Malik back from Royce. But Malik wasn't shouting or flailing. His movements were terrifying in their calmness. His left arm clutched the sobbing Kalen protectively against his chest, while his right hand clenched tightly around the cigarette lighter that had fallen from Royce's grasp moments earlier. The plastic casing felt warm, almost alive, like a conduit for the fury building inside him. "Sir, please," Darren began, gripping Malik's shoulder. "You need to—" Malik stepped aside, not pushing Darren, just slipping past like water around a rock. His eyes didn't blink. They were fixed squarely on Royce, who had retreated 2 steps down the narrow aisle but now found himself boxed in by the beverage cart and the row of passengers too stunned to move. Royce's laugh broke the silence like a cracking branch. "It's just a burn," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice thick with contempt. "Babies cry all the time. Maybe you people shouldn't travel if you can't handle—" "Shut up," Malik said, his tone flat but sharp enough to slice the air. Royce paused, startled not by the words, but by the ice beneath them. The captain's voice came through the overhead speaker, announcing an emergency diversion. Halden Ridge Airfield. Estimated time, 37 minutes. But the words were background noise, distant and irrelevant. The real emergency had already happened. Malik had seen the skin on his son's face blister beneath that glowing cigarette tip. He had smelled burning flesh, heard a scream that would echo in his bones forever. The baby whimpered in his arms, each sound tightening the knot inside Malik's chest. His hand shook as he brushed a trembling finger along Kalen's cheek. It wasn't deep, not life-threatening, but it wasn't the size of the wound that mattered. It was the intent behind it, the hatred, the inhumanity. He rose slowly. The passengers nearby, once eager to film the unfolding drama, now lowered their phones. The look on Malik's face was not rage. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Royce's grin faltered. "Don't do anything stupid," Royce said, trying to chuckle, but the sound came out brittle. Malik held up the lighter. He didn't ignite it yet, just held it like a question. Darren stepped forward again, palms raised, voice tight with urgency. "Sir, please, think about your child. He needs you. Not this. I am thinking about him," Malik replied without turning, his voice hollow, barely above a whisper. His thumb clicked the lighter open. A small flame burst to life, flickering in the cabin's recycled air. The orange glow reflected in Malik's eyes, casting shadows across his face that made him look older, carved in stone. Royce's back hit the beverage cart. "You're crazy," he spat, trying to sidestep, but there was nowhere to go. "You're gonna go to jail for—" The flame edged closer. "You hurt him," Malik said softly. "You chose to." Passengers gasped. One man called out for security. Another whispered, "He's not really going to do it, is he?" But Malik didn't hear them. In his mind, he was still hearing Kaylin scream. He saw the moment Royce leaned forward with that cigarette, not by accident, not out of ignorance, but with cold, deliberate cruelty. That image had imprinted itself in Malik's mind, burned deeper than the mark on his son's cheek. The lighter moved, just inches. Royce's eyes widened. For the first time, he looked afraid. "Wait," he tried to say, but it was too late. The flame touched skin. A sharp, guttural scream erupted from Royce's throat, raw and animalistic. He twisted, trying to yank his face away, but Malik had already stepped back. He didn't hold it long. Just a second, maybe less, but long enough. Darren and another male attendant, Marcus, finally reached them. They pulled Malik away with force now, their arms locked around his shoulders. Malik didn't fight. His limbs went slack, the flame extinguished with the snap of his wrist. The lighter dropped to the floor, skittering under a seat. Kaylin cried, but not from pain this time, from confusion, from fear. Malik cradled him again, gently rocking his small body, pressing his lips to the child's temple with a whisper only Kaylin could hear. "I've got you. I've got you." Royce collapsed into a seat, clutching his cheek with both hands, whimpering like the very child he had harmed. The side of his face reddened with a small but distinct welt, a reflection of the injury he had inflicted on someone far more innocent. The silence that followed was thick. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the hum of the engine seemed to lower in reverence. Malik's breathing slowed. He did not look back at Royce. He did not explain himself. There was no need. Justice doesn't always wait for landing. It sometimes burns mid-air. The hiss of the lighter was the only sound in the cabin. It cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The tiny flame flickered inches from Royce Brenner's face, its glow dancing across the panic widening in his eyes. Malik Torin stood motionless, his arms steady, his breathing slow but uneven. Every fiber of his body trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable mix of rage and heartbreak that pulsed through him. Around them, the passengers were frozen, their faces pale, their hands gripping armrests as if the plane itself had stopped moving. Even the steady hum of the engines felt distant, drowned beneath the pounding in Malik's chest. Royce tried to speak, but his throat caught. His usual arrogance, the smirking cruelty, the mocking tone, had vanished. "You're insane," he managed to stammer, his voice cracking. Malik didn't answer. His silence was heavier than any threat, his eyes locked on the man who had dared harm his child. Kaylin whimpered softly in the crook of Malik's arm, his small cheek blistered, the faint scent of burned skin clinging to the air. Malik shifted the baby gently to his other arm, keeping him close, as if shielding him from the ugliness of the world that had just revealed itself. The aisle between them felt impossibly narrow. Darren Cole, the young flight attendant, stood only a few feet away, frozen in indecision. His lips parted, but no words came. Another crew member hovered behind him, whispering, "Call the captain now." But neither moved. The tension had trapped them all in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. Malik's expression was cold, almost calm, and that terrified them more than anger ever could. His voice finally broke the silence, low and shaking, yet controlled. "You touched my son. You branded him." Each word landed with deliberate weight, slicing through Royce's composure like shards of glass. Royce's back hit the cabin wall. His eyes darted wildly toward the other passengers, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene. But no one moved. The passengers who had watched him mock and sneer minutes ago now stared at him with disgust. He had crossed a line that no one could defend. Malik took a single step closer, holding the lighter steady. The small flame cast both their faces in gold and shadow, illuminating the contrast between fury and fear. "You think this is justice?" Royce muttered, trying to sound defiant, but his voice trembled. Malik tilted his head slightly, his tone almost a whisper. "No. This is memory." For a brief second, the plane seemed to hold its breath. The flame hovered in the air, trembling as if it too sensed what was about to happen. Royce tried to push himself backward, but there was nowhere left to go. Malik's eyes never left him, eyes that had seen cruelty, injustice, and now the moment of reckoning. And then, without warning, the lighter moved closer. A flash of orange met pale skin. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, thick and unmistakable. Royce screamed, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the silence and sent a ripple of horror through every seat. The noise cut through Malik's heart, but he didn't flinch. He held the lighter steady for only a second more, just enough for the lesson to be carved into Royce's memory, then snapped it shut. The sudden darkness after the flame died was deafening. Royce's cries turned into ragged sobs as he clutched his face, the skin around his cheek reddened and blistered. Darren finally surged forward, grabbing Malik's arm. "Please, sir, stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Another attendant joined him, struggling to pull Malik back, but the man didn't resist. The fury that had driven him seconds ago drained away, leaving only exhaustion. Malik looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, one trembling from the adrenaline, the other still holding his crying child close to his chest. Darren's voice trembled as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. We need to separate them," he said, turning to the other attendant. But the younger man shook his head, too shocked to move. Passengers whispered among themselves, their faces pale, some clutching their phones but too afraid to record. An older gentleman from 2 rows back stood briefly, then sat again, realizing this was not a moment for interference. It was one for reckoning. The air reeked of smoke and fear. Malik slowly turned toward Royce, who had sunk to the floor, gasping between curses and cries. "You will never forget this," Malik said quietly, his voice stripped of anger now, replaced by something colder, finality. "Every time you see your reflection, you'll remember the pain you caused my son." Royce tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat, lost in sobs. The passenger's stares pierced him from every direction, no longer pitying, no longer neutral. The man who had once relished humiliating others now sat humiliated before them all. The baby whimpered again, his small fingers brushing against Malik's chest. The sound pierced through the haze in Malik's mind, grounding him. He blinked, his breathing uneven, realization dawning slowly on what he had just done. Darren placed a cautious hand on his shoulder, voice trembling but gentle. "Please, Mr. Torrin, you need to sit down." For your son, Malik turned to him, his eyes hollow, his voice breaking slightly. "I am thinking about him," he whispered. He allowed the attendants to guide him back to his seat, his movements mechanical. The passengers silently shifted, giving him space as if he carried both fire and sorrow within him. Royce's cries softened into pitiful whimpers, and the cabin returned to a strange, heavy quiet. Malik held Kalen close, rocking him gently, murmuring apologies between shallow breaths. The baby's sobs eased, his small hand resting against his father's heart. Darren lingered near the galley, his eyes wide, unsure what to write in his report or how to explain what he had just witnessed. He knew that no manual, no policy could prepare someone for this kind of moment, when justice and pain collided mid-air. One by one, the passengers turned away, not out of indifference, but out of respect. No one looked at Royce the same way again. The smell of burnt flesh lingered faintly, a reminder that even in the sky, where laws were suspended by altitude, morality still carried weight. Malik's eyes closed for a moment as exhaustion settled in. He kissed Kalen's forehead, whispering a promise he wasn't sure he could ever keep, that his son would never know such pain again. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't shifted in row 14. Outside, the clouds drifted in soft silence, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the cabin. And in that fragile quiet, Malik sat unmoving, his thoughts a blur of rage, sorrow, and guilt. The lighter, now extinguished, lay on the floor between him and the man who had earned its flame, a silent symbol of both vengeance and consequence. Retribution had spoken, and silence became its witness. The captain's voice crackled to life over the intercom, its usual calm replaced by a slight tremor. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an onboard emergency, we are initiating an unscheduled landing at Halden Ridge Airfield. Emergency personnel will be waiting upon arrival. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." His words echoed through the cabin like a signal flare, sharp and final. Gasps, whispers, and the shuffle of anxious passengers followed in the silence that fell. Malik Torin didn't move. He sat still as stone, his arms locked protectively around his son, Kalen, who whimpered quietly against his chest. The boy's cheek, though now covered with a sterile pad, was red and inflamed, the mark left by Royce's cruel act still fresh. Malik's grip tightened as the memory flashed again, unbidden and raw. The glowing cigarette, the searing cry, the unbearable stillness that had come before his own fire erupted. Now, that fire had cooled into a hollow stillness, but not peace. Across the aisle, Royce Brenner sat hunched over, a cold cloth pressed to the side of his face where Malik had marked him in return. His lips moved constantly, barely audible, mumbling curses and fragments of sentences that drifted uselessly into the recycled cabin air. His arrogance had melted into something brittle and cracked, but Malik didn't look at him. He couldn't, not yet. He focused on the steady rise and fall of Kalen's breathing, on the tiny heartbeat that fluttered against his own. His son stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Malik gently rocked him, his jaw tightening. Flight attendant Darren Cole hovered in the galley, nervously adjusting the emergency medical kit in his hands, though he had no need to. His eyes kept flicking back toward Malik, then toward Royce, and then to the captain's closed cockpit door. He looked like a man trying to breathe through broken glass, each inhale shallow, uncertain. He had seen both the cruelty and the response, both acts lit by flame, both impossible to forget, and he didn't know which one would haunt him more. As the plane began its descent, the cabin lights flickered slightly, adjusting to landing mode. Malik's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, clouds unraveled in the sky like torn fabric, revealing streaks of golden light. The sun had finally broken through, spilling fractured warmth across the horizon. He thought of his father then, an old phrase he had spoken often, usually during late-night talks about strength, anger, and what it meant to be a man. When a man chooses between rage and restraint, his father would say, both will leave scars. Malik's reflection hovered faintly in the plexiglass window, tired eyes, a haunted face, a tiny body wrapped against him. He felt every moment of the flight pressing down on his shoulders like lead. The rage still hummed inside him, dulled now, but not gone. Restraint had come late. Justice had come with fire. But at what cost? A jolt shook the cabin as the landing gear deployed, the sound loud in the thick silence. Passengers exchanged glances across aisles and rows, some nervous, some sympathetic, all exhausted. A man near the back reached for his wife's hand. A teenager clutched a worn backpack tightly to his chest. No one dared speak. No one could pretend this was just another diverted flight. Darren walked slowly down the aisle, pausing beside Malik. "Sir," he said quietly, voice thin but sincere, "when we land, just know that some of us understand. Maybe not everything, but enough. He didn't wait for an answer. He just gave a brief nod and continued forward, preparing for touchdown. Royce stirred again, shifting uncomfortably, wincing beneath the cold compress. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, just a bitter breath and a clenched jaw. Whatever strength had fueled his earlier cruelty had burned away. He was alone now, an island in a cabin that no longer respected or feared him. The seatbelt sign blinked on again. Malik adjusted Kaylin's blanket gently, brushing the child's soft curls with shaking fingers. The baby opened his eyes for a moment, dazed and glassy, then nestled deeper into his father's chest. The hum of the engines shifted as the aircraft began its final approach. Below them, the tarmac stretched out like a promise or a reckoning. The descent felt slow, deliberate. Outside, the broken clouds hung like witnesses in the sky. Inside, Malik braced himself, not for the landing, but for whatever came after. The questions, the judgment, the explanations. He didn't know what awaited him beyond the runway, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He had protected his child. Whatever the world said after this, that would never change. The wheels screeched as they met the ground, jolting the cabin once more. Gasps filled the air, followed by silence. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, holding his son a little tighter. He felt the weight of every decision he had made, and the consequences waiting to unfold. No one applauded. No one moved. Not yet. Sometimes justice lands harder than the plane itself. As soon as the aircraft doors opened, chaos met the ground. Uniformed airport security officers surged up the jet bridge, their radios crackling as paramedics pushed past them, wheeling medical kits and stretchers. The warm, pressurized air of the cabin rushed outward, meeting the cold edge of real-world consequence. Malik Torin stood near the front of the cabin, his son, Kaylin, cradled tightly in his arms. The child whimpered softly, his cheek still red and blistered from the cigarette burn. Malik stepped forward into the aisle without hesitation, his voice calm but urgent. "Please, he needs help," he said, holding out the infant to the approaching medics. One of the paramedics, a tall man with graying hair and a navy jumpsuit, stepped forward and gently took Kaylin into his arms. "We've got him," the medic said, inspecting the wound carefully. "He's stable, but we'll treat the burn immediately." Malik's eyes followed his son as the team moved swiftly, laying the toddler on a stretcher with practiced ease. A rush of relief passed through Malik's chest, but it was fleeting. The moment he turned back toward the cabin, reality came crashing down. A second group of security officers was already making its way toward him. One of them, a short and stocky man with a clipboard, raised a hand. "Sir, we need you to step aside for questioning," he said, his tone neutral but firm. Malik raised his hands slowly. He wasn't surprised. This was the moment he'd been bracing for ever since the lighter left his hand. He glanced back toward the rows of passengers, many of whom were now standing or craning their necks to watch the scene unfold. Behind them, Royce Brenner erupted into a fit of shouting as paramedics tried to treat the burn scar on his face. "He attacked me. I'm the victim here," Royce yelled, voice raw and cracking. "Arrest him. He's dangerous." His voice echoed through the cabin like an alarm bell, drawing unwanted attention and stirring murmurs among passengers. He tried to stand, pushing away the paramedics. "You saw it. You all saw it. He burned me." Darren Cole stepped forward, pale and shaken, but his voice was clear. "No, sir," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Everyone saw what you did first." A pause followed, heavy and charged. Passengers began nodding. Some murmured in agreement. Others began pulling out their phones, showing videos they had recorded discreetly during the flight. One man, older and sharply dressed with silver hair tucked behind his ears, stepped forward. "My name's Levran," he said, handing his phone to one of the officers. "This footage starts before the screaming, before the cigarette." The officer watched the screen carefully, lips pressed in a straight line. Darren leaned closer, confirming what was shown. Malik remained silent through it all, his breathing steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Sir," another officer said to Malik, voice softer this time, "we'll still need to speak with you, but it looks like your side of the story is already being told." Malik gave a nod. His face didn't change. He had no energy left for relief. They led him gently past the rows of seats. Darren stepped aside to let him through. As Malik passed him, the young flight attendant whispered, "I'm sorry." Malik gave him a brief glance. No anger, no forgiveness yet, just a tired understanding. At the aircraft door, Malik paused and turned his head. The paramedics were tending to Kalen, wrapping his tiny cheek with a medicated dressing. The child was crying quietly but alert, a medic rubbing his back gently. Royce was seated several rows back, surrounded by paramedics, his face wrapped in cold gauze. His expression had shifted from rage to something unreadable, perhaps shame, perhaps fear, or just the dull ache of consequence finally arriving. Malik didn't look triumphant. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had used the last of his strength to do what needed to be done, and now stood hollowed out by it. There were no cheers, no applause, just the hum of equipment, the shuffle of feet, and the low murmur of people realizing they had witnessed something irreversible. As the officers guided Malik toward the gate, away from the crowd, he looked back one last time, toward his son, safe in capable hands, and Royce, now surrounded by the system he had never feared before. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only exhaustion and a father's quiet grief. Some victories leave no joy, only peace earned through fire. He pressed a burning cigarette to a baby's face, laughing as the child's skin blistered in agony. If you believe justice must answer every act of hate, hit subscribe now. The fire of truth burns hotter than revenge. The moment the plane landed and the video footage made its way online, the world seemed to split in two. Within hours, Malik Torran's name dominated every news cycle, every social feed, every living room conversation. The first clips were shaky, recorded by fellow passengers, but unmistakable. They showed a father standing with quiet rage, holding his son close, facing a man who had just burned a baby's face with a cigarette. The audio was crackling, but clear enough. Royce's voice sneering, "It's just a burn." Then the hiss of flame. Then the scream. Then Malik's final act, swift, precise, burning justice delivered at 38,000 feet. As the media storm swirled, the world debated. Some hailed Malik as a father pushed to the brink, forced to protect what the system so often failed to. Talk shows dissected his calm demeanor, the restraint he showed until there was no choice. Others, however, condemned him, calling his response brutal, claiming that justice should never be delivered with fire, no matter the provocation. In a quiet office in downtown Ravenport, Malik sat opposite his attorney, Aaron Merrick. The walls were bare, save for a framed certificate above a modest bookshelf. Aaron was young, focused, and determined, flipping through files with the precision of a surgeon. "We need to frame this for what it was," Aaron said, his tone deliberate. "Not rage, not revenge, but instinct, a protective act, a reaction that any father in that moment might have made. Malik didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the window, watching the branches of a nearby tree sway in the wind. "I didn't think," he said finally, his voice low. "I just saw the mark on Kalen's face. Saw him crying like that, in pain." Everything else went silent. Aaron leaned forward, his fingers steepled. That's exactly what they need to understand. The jury, the public, the judge. You didn't plan it. You weren't looking for a fight. You acted to protect someone who couldn't protect himself. Outside the office, protesters began to gather in small groups, some carrying signs reading "Justice for Malik," others with messages like "No excuse for violence." The city had become a pressure cooker of opinions and emotions. Meanwhile, Royce's own past began to unravel publicly. News stations uncovered a long string of complaints filed against him during past flights, verbal altercations, aggressive behavior, even one physical incident with a gate agent. The image he had tried to paint of himself as a victim quickly cracked under scrutiny. A particularly damning clip surfaced from just 2 years prior, showing Royce berating a fellow passenger with racial slurs during a flight delay. The more people learned, the more sympathy shifted, and it shifted fast. Malik's first court hearing was held under tight security. The courtroom was packed, journalists filled the back rows, cameras waited just outside, and officers stood watch along the walls. Malik entered quietly, dressed in a simple gray suit, his expression unreadable. Darren Cole, the young flight attendant who had witnessed everything, sat nervously on the witness bench. When his turn came to speak, his voice trembled at first, but with each word, he grew steadier. "I should have stepped in earlier," Darren admitted, looking directly at Malik. "When Roy started saying things, when he flicked that lighter near the baby, I felt something was wrong. But I froze. I just froze." The courtroom listened in silence as he described the events, moment by moment. The lighter, the cigarette, the scream. Darren's testimony painted a clear picture, not of a man who lost control, but of a father who had held on until the very last line was crossed. Aaron rose to cross-examine Royce, who sat on the stand with his arm in a sling, a fresh bandage covering the burn across his cheek. His answers were clipped, defensive. "You assaulted a baby, Mr. Brenner," Aaron said plainly. "And now you expect to be seen as a victim," Royce sneered. "It was an accident." "I didn't mean to touch the kid, but you did touch him," Aaron pressed. "You held a lit cigarette inches from his face." Royce's jaw tightened. "I didn't think it would burn him." That moment sealed the room. The gasps were quiet, but undeniable. A father had reacted to pain inflicted on his baby, while the man who caused it showed no remorse. Back at home, Malik tried to shield Kalen from the noise. Reporters camped outside his building. Neighbors offered cautious support. Some crossed the street to avoid him. But every night he held his son close, kissed the bandaged cheek, and whispered, "You're safe now." Aaron visited frequently, bringing updates, court documents, and growing confidence. "We're not just winning hearts, Malik," he said after the third hearing. "We're winning facts." The final day of testimony ended with a statement from Malik himself. Standing in front of the judge, he spoke not with anger, but clarity. "I didn't act out of hate. I acted because I looked into my son's eyes and saw fear, and I knew, in that moment, that I would do whatever it took to keep him safe." The courtroom was silent as he returned to his seat, Kalen's soft breathing audible from the back, where a friend held him close. Though the case had not yet reached its verdict, the tide had turned. Public opinion leaned heavily in Malik's favor. News anchors changed their tone. Online petitions called for all charges to be dropped. But Malik knew better than to count on the court of public opinion. He had seen what silence could allow. He had lived through how quickly peace could burn. As he stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the air smelled like rain, but the skies had not opened yet. He paused, lifting Kalen into his arms. The child smiled faintly, drowsy from the long day, and rested his head on Malik's shoulder. Malik exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of everything pressing down, but also something else. Something quieter. The beginning of resolve. In the eyes of law, mercy and justice often fight the same battle. Malik stood in the center of the courtroom, the wooden floor beneath him steady but cold. A faint rustle of papers and the low murmur of shifting bodies filled the chamber, but to Malik it was all background noise. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, a gray-haired man with a solemn expression, lips pressed tightly in contemplation. The courtroom lights, stark and unforgiving, reflected off the polished mahogany benches, casting long shadows that stretched toward the back walls. A dozen faces looked on, jurors, spectators, court officers, but Malik felt the weight of only one pair of eyes. His son's, watching from a nearby bench, held gently in the arms of his legal advocate, Aaron Merrick. Aaron gave Malik a subtle nod of reassurance. The young lawyer's hands were clasped tightly around a stack of closing arguments, though they were no longer needed. It was Malik's voice the courtroom had come to hear now, not his. "Mr. Torrin," the judge said, leaning slightly forward, his fingers interlocked above the bench. "Before I render this court's decision, you may speak. Do you have anything to say?" Malik took a single step forward. He didn't glance at the press gathered in the back row or the prosecutors seated opposite him. His voice was steady, but every syllable carried the weight of sleepless nights, courtroom flashbacks, and a father's silent fury. "I regret the pain my son endured," he said, eyes locked on the judge's, "but I don't regret protecting him." A quiet gasp came from one corner of the gallery. A cameraman paused his lens mid-pan. Even the court reporter momentarily froze, her fingers hovering above her keyboard. The judge didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, gazing thoughtfully at Malik for several long, measured seconds. The silence felt like an eternity stretched across the hardwood floor. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun filtered through heavy glass panes, casting golden rectangles across the room. Malik's heart beat slowly, rhythmically, like a drum marking the approach of something inevitable. Finally, the judge shifted, his gavel resting loosely between his fingers. "This court recognizes the severity of the incident aboard Flight 317 and the highly emotional context in which your actions took place," he began. "While the use of force is never encouraged, we cannot ignore the evidence. You acted in defense of your child after he was harmed." Royce Brenner sat slumped in the defendant's box across the room, his jaw wrapped in medical gauze, eyes dark and sunken. He shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath as the judge continued. "Therefore, this court issues a suspended sentence in your case, Mr. Torrin. You will serve no jail time, but you will be required to attend anger response counseling and participate in a parent safety initiative for 6 months. A murmur rippled through the audience, quiet, unsure, but distinct. "Mr. Brenner," the judge said, turning his eyes toward Royce, "this court finds you guilty of assault on a minor, with aggravating circumstances aboard a commercial aircraft. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years probation, mandatory psychological evaluation, and you are permanently banned from traveling on any U.S. commercial airline." Royce's mouth twisted, as if trying to form an objection, but his attorney placed a hand on his arm and shook his head, silencing him. The judge raised the gavel and, without another word, brought it down with a firm crack. "This court is adjourned." Applause was not allowed in the courtroom, but it erupted anyway, a restrained chorus of relief and justice mingling in the room. Even the bailiff hesitated before calling for order. In the middle of it all, Malik exhaled, his shoulders lowering as if the invisible weight had finally shifted. Aaron stepped beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You stood strong, Malik." They listened. Outside the courthouse, sunlight greeted him like a blessing. The sky above was a deep blue, streaked with hints of orange as the late afternoon took hold. A gentle breeze rolled through the trees lining the steps, rustling their leaves like whispers of something ending, or perhaps beginning. Malik descended the steps slowly, holding Kaylin close to his chest. The child's cheek was healing, a soft bandage still covering the tender skin. Kaylin reached up and touched Malik's collar with curious fingers. Malik kissed the top of his son's head. Reporters shouted questions from a distance, cameras flashing, but none of it mattered. Not now. A few feet away, Royce was ushered through a separate exit, his steps slow and head lowered, escorted by court security. The man who once burned a child now faced a public who saw through his lies. Malik didn't turn to look. He walked on, the sound of his son's small breath the only noise that mattered. A man passing by gave him a respectful nod. Another offered a quiet, "Thank you." Strangers who'd seen the footage, who'd followed the case, now looked at Malik not as a criminal, but as something else, something stronger. A father, a protector, a symbol of endurance. Aaron joined him outside, carrying Malik's coat. "They're already calling it a landmark case," he said, half smiling. "Policy changes are being discussed. Airlines are talking about passenger protection reforms." Malik looked at his son, who stared up at the open sky. "Good," he said quietly, "but we still have more to do." The courthouse loomed behind them, its stone pillars towering, its shadow long and cool across the pavement. But the path forward was sunlit. As the pair walked toward the waiting car, Malik paused briefly, eyes lifting toward the warm blaze of the sun. He didn't need to look back. He knew the scars would remain, but so would the lesson, that love, even when tested by hate, endures. The flame that burned became the light that guided them forward. Malik opened his eyes to the soft light filtering through the living room curtains, the weight of morning pressing gently on his chest. Kaylin's tiny hand rested against his neck, the child's breathing slow and peaceful. But Malik's peace was fragile, always shattered by the echo that lived inside his skull, the scream. It came not with sound, but with sensation. He'd hear it when the wind slipped through a window crack just right, or when his own breath caught too suddenly. That shrill, piercing cry of his son had embedded itself into his bones. 3 months had passed since the courtroom's decision. 3 months of quiet streets, park benches, and slow walks with the child who now smiled more than he cried. And yet, sleep still felt like a negotiation, an agreement between his weary body and a restless mind. He had returned to Ravenport, to the modest home tucked near the park where he used to jog before fatherhood changed everything. Now he pushed a stroller every morning beneath the branches of old elm trees, nodding politely to neighbors who recognized him from the news but said nothing. He was grateful for their silence. Malik hadn't gone back to the firm. His desk remained untouched, emails piling up in a forgotten inbox. The company had offered him a mental health sabbatical, wrapped in sympathy and liability. But Malik didn't need pity. He needed stillness. The only schedule he honored now was Kaylin's, feeding, changing, sleeping, and walking. And in those walks he found rhythm, if not peace. That afternoon he sat outside Theo's Bean House, a small cafe where he used to read engineering journals during lunch breaks. Kaylin sat beside him in a high chair, gnawing on a rubber giraffe. The boy's cheek, though mostly healed, still bore a pale scar that curved like a comma near his left eye. Strangers tried not to stare, but Malik always noticed the flicker of confusion or guilt in their eyes. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and a young man stepped out, notebook under one arm, camera slung across his shoulder. He wore a charcoal blazer too big for his frame and shoes scuffed from chasing stories that rarely paid well. His name was Jonas Laren, a freelance journalist who'd messaged Malik twice before. Both times, Malik had declined. But today, something in the quiet hum of the street made him nod when Jonas approached. "Mr. Torrin?" Jonas asked, hesitant. Malik looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "You're the writer." Jonas smiled, but it was more nervous than cheerful. "Yes, I appreciate you agreeing to meet. I promise I'm not here to stir anything up." "Then why are you here?" Malik asked, his voice calm, not unkind. Jonas pulled out a chair but didn't sit until Malik gestured. "I've been covering stories like yours, people caught in moments where everything changes in seconds. Most reports focus on the violence or the court ruling, but I'm more interested in what happens after Malik studied him. What happens after is silence. And trying to make your child laugh again," Jonas nodded. "That's what I want to write about. Not just what you did, but how you carried it afterward. How someone holds dignity under pressure. Malik said nothing for a while. He spooned mashed banana into Kalen's mouth, wiped his chin, and leaned back in his chair. You won't get a dramatic headline here, Jonas. There's no shouting, just echoes. That's exactly what I want, Jonas replied, voice steady now. I want people to see you, not just the moment you were pushed, but the strength it takes to keep walking after. Something in Malik softened, like a gate creaking open. He nodded slowly. All right, one interview. They spoke for nearly an hour, the afternoon sun shifting across the table. Jonas asked questions with care, never pushing, never circling pain like a vulture. Malik answered in short, thoughtful sentences. He spoke about the weight of being watched, the judgment from those who thought he'd gone too far, and the quiet apologies from men who said they'd have done worse. He spoke about Kalen's first night sleeping soundly again, and how he wept in the hallway afterward, not from joy, but release. What do you remember most? Jonas asked near the end. Malik didn't hesitate. The look in his eyes before he did it. Royce. There was nothing human in that look, just fire, looking for something to consume. Jonas wrote the words down carefully, then closed his notebook. Thank you for trusting me. Malik nodded, standing to pack up the stroller. Just don't make me a symbol, he said quietly. I'm just a father who refused to be silent. The article was published a week later. It was titled, The Weight of Protection. No sensational photos, no courtroom drama. Just Malik's voice, clear and unwavering, laid bare across the pages. Neighbors began to greet him again. Fathers stopped him in the park, some quietly handing him folded letters. Others just nodded, words caught in their throats. Malik read every letter. Some were from strangers who had never defended their children and regretted it. Others were from men who knew exactly what it meant to be judged not by action, but by restraint. He never sought fame. He hadn't wanted a platform. But truth, when spoken without anger or apology, had power. Jonas's article didn't make Malik a hero. It made him human. And for the first time in months, Malik fell asleep without fear of that scream. Truth, when told with grace, heals louder than judgment ever could. The first letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, tucked between bills and junk mail, the envelope slightly crumpled and smudged with water. Malik almost tossed it aside, but something about the shaky handwriting made him pause. He tore it open slowly, the paper inside thin and worn, as if written with trembling hands. Dear Mr. Torrin, it began, I don't know you personally, but I saw what happened, and I want to thank you. Malik read it twice. The words weren't polished, but they were sincere, written by a father who had once been too afraid to defend his own son on a train where passengers turned away. You did what many of us wish we had the strength to do. The letter ended. Malik sat still, the letter resting lightly in his hand, yet pressing on his heart with the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. Over the next few months, more letters arrived. Some were from parents, others from complete strangers. Black fathers, war veterans, even a retired pilot who confessed that he'd once ignored a similar case of bias on a flight. I regret my silence, he wrote. You reminded me that silence can be a wound just as deep as action. Malik kept each letter in a wooden box beside Kalen's crib, rereading them during sleepless nights when his mind still wandered back to the flash of flame, the scream, and the unbearable scent of burned flesh. Gratitude wasn't what he had expected. He had acted without thinking of recognition, driven only by instinct and pain. But the letters were a balm he hadn't known he needed, proof that the truth had reached people beyond that aircraft cabin. Meanwhile, Royce Brenner's name all but vanished from public memory. He served his short sentence quietly, re-emerging once to file a lawsuit against the airline, claiming negligence and emotional distress. But the case collapsed quickly when over a dozen passengers offered statements against him. some even attending the hearing voluntarily. The judge dismissed the suit with finality. Royce didn't show his face in court again. Then, unexpectedly, Darren Cole reached out. Malik was standing in line at a local bakery when the message came, an email, simple and unassuming. Darren apologized in the opening sentence and asked if Malik would be willing to meet. Not for closure, he wrote, but for accountability. Curiosity wrestled with wariness. Malik agreed, but insisted they meet in public. The coffee shop in downtown Ravenport was quiet that afternoon, sunlight filtering through tall windows, casting soft shadows on the wooden floor. Darren arrived early, seated near the window, his hands clasped nervously around a ceramic mug. When Malik walked in, holding Kaylin in his arm, Darren stood immediately, face flushed. I just wanted to say thank you, Darren began, his voice hoarse, and I'm sorry. For hesitating, for not stepping in sooner. That night, I failed you. I failed. Kaylin Malik studied him carefully. Darren looked thinner than he remembered, the lightness in his expression dimmed by guilt. I don't need an apology, Malik said, his voice calm but firm. But I appreciate it. They sat. Darren explained how the incident had haunted him. He had nearly quit aviation altogether, but instead joined a grassroots organization advocating for in-flight safety and bias training. I'm still learning, he admitted, but I'm not running anymore. Malik listened, his fingers gently brushing Kaylin's curls as the boy gnawed on the corner of a teething toy. There was sincerity in Darren's tone, the kind that couldn't be rehearsed. Change doesn't erase what happened, Malik finally said, but it means something. It means someone's listening now. That evening, Malik walked home in silence, Kaylin sleeping against his chest. The streets of Ravenport were quiet, the breeze cool and comforting. His mind turned over Darren's words, the letters, the gratitude from strangers. He realized that what he had endured had grown beyond him. It had taken shape in others' courage, in their choices, in their willingness to speak up. The thought settled in him like a quiet drumbeat. A week later, he filed paperwork for a nonprofit. He named it the Kaylin Foundation. Its mission was clear, to support families who had endured trauma during travel, especially those whose voices were ignored or dismissed. It would provide legal aid, emotional counseling, and training programs for airline and travel staff across the country. The first donation came from an anonymous passenger from that flight, just a small check and a note that read, "Thank you for teaching us what protection looks like." In the months that followed, Malik immersed himself in the Foundation's work. He met with counselors, lawyers, and airline consultants. He attended forums on travel discrimination, spoke quietly but firmly about the need for dignity, for awareness, for systems that saw every passenger as human first. But it wasn't just the work that changed him. It was the purpose. For the first time since that day on the plane, Malik didn't feel weighed down by fury. He didn't walk around bracing for a fight. He walked forward, for his son, for others like him. For the first time in months, Malik felt something deeper than anger, purpose. From ashes of injustice rose a quiet mission of healing. Malik stood at the far end of the newly renovated airport lounge, the leather handle of his son's carry bag still in one hand, his eyes fixed on the wall ahead. The space was quiet, serene, bathed in the gentle glow of overhead lights designed to mimic natural sunset. The walls bore no advertisements, only a long, sweeping mural of candid photographs. Fathers holding children, brothers helping older siblings board, security officers assisting elderly travelers. At the center of it all was a brushed steel plaque framed in warm oak. It read, in sharp, unflinching lettering, "Every passenger matters." A quiet gasp behind him snapped Malik back to the present. His son, Kaylin, now 2 and full of restless energy, had broken away from the low-cushioned bench and was sprinting toward him, arms flailing, tiny sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Malik dropped the bag gently and knelt to catch the child, sweeping him up into his arms just before the boy could crash into his legs. Kaylin burst into laughter, a full-bellied, unburdened sound that echoed through the lounge like music Malik never thought he'd hear again. Malik held him tightly for a moment longer than usual, breathing in the scent of toddler shampoo and sunshine. The child's cheek, once scarred and swollen, now bore only a faint mark near the jawline, nearly invisible, but never forgotten. It reminded Malik of how close he had come to losing not just his son's smile, but his sense of safety in the world. Every time he looked at that mark, he remembered the scream, the heat, the silence that followed. He stood slowly, adjusting Kaylin on his hip, and turned toward the tall glass windows that overlooked the tarmac. Beyond the glass, rows of jet bridges extended like outstretched arms, guiding families and business travelers alike onto planes bound for every corner of the country. The sight once filled Malik with dread. Now it brought only quiet resolve. From the corner of the lounge, a voice called out. "Malik," came the familiar tone, calm and respectful. It was Jonas Laren, the journalist who had interviewed him more than a year ago. He stood by the refreshments counter, notebook in hand, camera slung across his shoulder, his eyes filled with cautious hope. "Do you have a minute?" Malik nodded. "Of course," he replied, walking over. Kaylin clung to his shoulder now, quieter but still alert, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Jonas flipped open the notebook, already halfway through his first question. "They told me you'd be here today." "I wanted to follow up, for the foundation piece." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Still writing about us after all this time?" Jonas smiled faintly. "You don't realize how many lives that day touched." "Some stories don't fade. They grow." Malik gestured toward the plaque. "That's not just a slogan," he said. "It's a promise. Every airline we've partnered with, every crew member who's gone through the new protocols, it's because of that promise." He could feel Jonas's gaze sharpen, the way a writer leans forward when he senses truth just beneath the surface. Malik didn't flinch. "We didn't build the Kaylin Foundation to shame anyone," Malik continued. "We built it so no parent, no child, has to carry fear like luggage." Jonas scribbled quickly. "And yet, some still criticize the initiative. They say the past is the past. That what happened to you was isolated." Malik's expression didn't change. "Isolated doesn't mean impossible to repeat." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Outside, a child's voice echoed near the boarding gate, a soft laugh followed by the clatter of wheels on tile. Malik looked out again, his eyes following the crowd. He saw a father in uniform guiding his son through security, an older man adjusting his grandson's coat, two teenage boys helping their uncle into a wheelchair. So many stories, none of them Malik's, but all of them worth protecting. "There was a time," Malik said quietly, "when I couldn't look at an airport without remembering fire." Jonas waited. "But now," he continued, "I look around and I see prevention. I see dignity. I see people who've learned to pause before they judge a crying baby or a tired father." Kaylin tugged gently at his collar. Malik looked down and smiled. "Ready to go?" he asked the boy, who responded by reaching for his father's face with a small, contented yawn. Jonas raised his pen again. "Can I quote you on something? What do you want people to take away from this moment?" Malik paused, thoughtful. Then, without a trace of hesitation, he turned back toward the window, watching as another plane took off, its silver wings cutting clean through the horizon. He spoke with clarity, his voice steady and resolute. "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about prevention." As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Malik realized that his scars, both visible and invisible, had turned into symbols of strength. The fire that once destroyed had become the light that guided others home. He scarred an innocent child forever, and moments later felt the same fire sear his own flesh. If you believe justice always finds its way back, subscribe now. No hand that harms the innocent goes unpunished. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, arrogance, and the consequences of hatred and cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, justice, and accountability in the face of discrimination.